Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Elliot Morgan. Hi, Elliot. How are you?
Not bad, thanks. How you doing, Kieran?
Yeah, all good. Now, today we're going to focus our attention on TDaPE London, which is obviously the conference we are running to raise money for Velindre Cancer Centre. And I thought tickets close on the 11th of January. We've only got, 5 days at school, perhaps four. And so anyone who's keen to go, I thought we'd explore the conference in depth, what's on offer, what type of sessions people can expect, because I think, getting a place at the conference this side of Christmas, I think is a smart move. And so just trying to help people along. So with that in mind, looking at the 36 roughly speakers that we've got lined up, aside from your own, is there anything that really stands out to you in terms of you can't wait to go and see it?
I quite like there's a couple spelling sessions, and I think I tried to go through my mind and think of have I ever actually attended any CPD about spelling, and I couldn't think of a single time in my career that I've ever had any actual development on it. And although that doesn't really fit in much of my role these days, I think it's still quite an interesting thing to learn about. So I'm quite excited to see Madeline Roberts or Layla Sadler, depending how it's always difficult, isn't it? You always get the choice anxiety, and there's so many good sessions. They all sound interesting. I'd happily listen to them all. But that particular strand around spelling and handwriting, I think might be quite interesting.
Yeah, because I think Madeline is at ARC,
Right.
part of their development team, and I'm not entirely 100% certain what, because I know ARC was a multi-academy trust. Is that still the sort of format that they take on, or have they gone even bigger?
I'm not sure. I believe so. I don't know.
Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see, because obviously you would imagine then these ideas would be tested out across a number of schools, and so pretty robust
Yeah.
in terms of both how they apply to the classroom, but also in different contexts as well.
Yeah, and they've got their mass mastery scheme, don't they? So their materials are supported by pedagogical foundations, aren't they? Like sensible pedagogy. So should be quite good.
Yeah, and I mean, I've just put it up on the screen. Anyone who's watching on Spotify or YouTube will be able to see that Neil Almond also finds himself in this. He's got his improving handwriting, a low hanging fruit for educational success. I mean, have you read his chapter yet?
I have. I was very fortunate to read it. He sent it to me. I thought it was really, really interesting. Similar to what I was just saying about spelling. I don't think I'd ever gone for any sort of CPD reading or in person or remote or any other sort of form of CPD for it. I found it really, really interesting. So if he's just going through that same research, that's going to be another one that I may head to. Is he going to be wearing that velvet smooth dinner jacket in the that he's got in the photo? Because if he is, I'm there.
Yeah, we may have to demand that because he does look pretty smooth in his velvet. Yeah, is it a burgundy color perhaps?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Smooth.
yeah. So I mean, I would group those three. So Leila Sadler from Sounds Right. She's going to explore sound to print approach to reading and spelling. And I've sort of got her in two
Right.
groups because it's both reading and spelling, and it's that relationship. So I would, if you're looking at, we've got a group of people talking about different elements of reading, and I think Layla's sort of ties in quite nicely across both of them. So I think if you're interested in literacy, and I know that literacy episodes do particularly well on the podcast, like
Right.
there's a lot of uptake. So I think a lot of people are interested. So these three, what I'll probably try and do is make sure that they're not on at the same time, so that if anyone
Yeah.
wants to listen to the literacy thread, I mean, some of the themes we have more speakers than we have sort of session windows, but
Yeah.
with these ones, I think I can do that pretty pretty easily.
I think that's a very sensible decision because, as you say, even for us, sort of like if you're a generalist or you're a subject specialist, this is the sort of like knowledge you need across whichever subject you teach. Because spelling, handwriting, reading, those things are ubiquitous in whatever you're teaching, aren't they? So yeah, very very interesting strand.
Yeah, like you say, things that you don't necessarily get trained on that
Yeah.
often unless your school happens to have a focus on it. Was there anything, or is there any session you think that really took you by surprise? You're thinking, "Oh, I've actually never thought about that." So obviously these would be on your radar. And you thought, oh, I'd like training on these. Was there anything that really jumped out and go, well, actually, I'd never really thought about that? And, almost like a curveball that you go to.
Yes, I mean, well, as I said before, they all sound and look particularly interesting. But one session that I think does sound particularly interesting, has piqued my interest, is Nathan Burns, his session on making metacognition work in primary. My understanding and reading around metacognition is fairly limited. I've done some of it, but I think at the primary level, the only stuff I've ever sort of seen around is people talking about sort of growth mindset and fixed mindset. And I think metacognition obviously goes a lot further than that. And I've seen a lot of people talk about it in secondary, but I'm quite intrigued by what it looks like in the primary phase, because it filters into all teaching, every subject, every lesson. We want children to be like reflective learners, thinking about how they've come to a conclusion or whatever it may be. So yeah, that sounds particularly interesting, and not something I've heard of before, the sort of metacognition in the broad sense being discussed, particularly at the primary phase. What about you? Is any of them sparking that in your mind?
Yeah, Debbie Morgan, Dr. Debbie Morgan, I should say, is doing a session called What's Oracy Got to Do with Mathematics? And obviously, oracy is a bit of a buzzword at the moment. So I'd be very interested because I know Debbie thinks very deeply about her work and the sort of message that she does, obviously, in a place of enormous responsibility at the head of the NCTM. And so I'm very interested to see, I don't know how many sessions I'll actually get to go to on the day, just by making sure everything's ticking over and stuff. But if I do get a chance, I'd like to see Debbie Morgan talk about oracy because I think it's something that our local maths hub are focusing on, and something that I'm interested to learn about, because it's one of those ones where I think when something gains momentum, then there are a lot of voices. I don't know, probably equated to manipulatives maybe about 10 years ago. And all of a sudden, there was a lot of information that wasn't necessarily helpful for teachers at the same time. So I'm not for a second saying the Debbie session will be like that, but I want to know what someone who thinks carefully thinks about oracy, because I think it's a good starting point for someone like me at a relative novice position, I think.
Yeah. Well, she's obviously particularly knowledgeable about maths, isn't she? And I think, like you say, there's a lot of, not only is oracy a bit of a buzzword at the moment, there's a lot of noise around oracy. So it'll be very interesting to have a session that sort of cuts through that noise and goes, well, look, this is what actual practical application is like in a mathematics classroom. And I guess that's not necessarily a subject that immediately springs to mind when you think of oracy compared to history or something. There's a lot of discussion. I know that there's obviously work you can really done around open-ended problem solving and reasoning and so on. But I imagine Debbie's going to go into a lot more depth than that, and that will be very interesting to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got quite a few really interesting maths ones. So we got Tom Oakley. His session's called Time for Change. And I think his focus will be on the national curriculum, the place of time, and perhaps how we approach time in primary, which I know is something we discussed on the podcast quite a bit.
Yeah, well, having tried to teach time in year 2, I can. We've all had that struggle. So yeah, that sounds interesting as well.
Yeah, yeah, we got Kate Fruit, who was obviously on the podcast, really well received when she was on the podcast. Amy High as well, talking about the Wreck and Wreck. And then Janine Allen actually was the first person to give me math CBD when I became a teacher.
Oh, so wow.
All the way back at the start, and when I started teaching in Medway, Janine would run the local authority sort of, I don't know if it's not cluster training, but
yeah, I went to similar sort of things. Yeah, great.
No, this is back in the day when you had like lunch put on for you and stuff like that.
Right. I do miss. Yeah, ours was like a local golf club. To this day, the best food, the best spread I've ever had.
Sometimes we would go to Jill's. We would go to
really?
Priestfield. Yeah, I remember having a chicken dinner at Priestfield.
Wow.
I can't remember what it was for.
The golf club we used to go to, I just remember it always had like chicken dippers with like a range of sauces, and that you just had me sold. That was great.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, Janine's going to talk about subject knowledge or expertise. What's the difference? And then sort of rounding it off, you got Joe Austin talking about forward-facing primary mathematics and almost the idea. I mean, he's going to tell you what it means and why it matters, but it's almost this, the things we do today have an impact later on. And so I think, I'm really happy with the maths. You'll notice I'm not on there because it's not about me. It's about the sort of wonderful voices. And also having lots of people who are in the class, I think, is really important too. So obviously Joe and Tom,
Yeah.
I mean, Tom's deputy head, so I don't know how much time he actually gets to spend in class, but he's definitely at the chalk face in terms of his contacts and stuff like that there. And then obviously reading's quite popular. And some guy called Chris Such, have you heard of him?
No, I don't think so. No.
He did his thing where he was threading about it on social media. So he'll probably have threaded the entirety of the talk by the time we get to that point.
And he wants a double session. God, that's a bit greedy, isn't it?
Well, he's and he was going to do it back to back. I thought give people a chance to get up
To
out of their
soak it in.
seats.
Yeah.
But he's doing the theory first and then the application, because obviously his first
Right.
book is very theory laden. I mean, the
Yeah.
last section of his book is reasonably practical, but
Yeah.
obviously his new book is entirely
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
what does this look like? I mean, have you caught his most recent talk?
I don't think I've caught his recent one, but I have read a fair chunk of the new book. And if you're somebody who has any sort of responsibility in overseeing teaching and learning around reading, I would highly recommend you go to the talk, because the book, when it comes out, is just going to be full of golden ideas for practice, just actionable stuff. Yeah, just it's full to the brim of just useful ideas and how to actually enact it in the classroom. Quite a refreshing read in that sense, because it's not theory. It's actually like let's think about how we can actually do this in the classroom.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll have a couple of those books on the day. I'm trying to do like a raffle kind of thing.
Yeah.
Hopefully he'll bring along a few of those. I know he's always hawking them on social media. And the thing is, I heard he charges like £10,000 for like an hour and a half session. So
Yeah.
you could get like for a fraction of that price, you could get your whole school to see the CPD, well below his normal extortionate
Yeah.
fees that he charges schools.
No brainer. This is his one I forget what the Latin term is, where like lawyers do free work. Pro bono.
Pro bono.
This is his only pro bono work of the year. The rest of the time he's like Scrooge McDuck.
There's a YouTube joke in there. Normally quite anti Bono, but that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting reading for pleasure because it's come up twice, and I'll try and keep those two separate. Dr.
Yeah.
Kirsten Fenton, who I think is traveling all the way from Edinburgh,
Wow.
not quite the furthest speaker travel distance, but perspective from the classroom, and then Chris Baker, the what, why, and how of reading for pleasure, which would be really interesting.
And also, is it? I don't know how to say the surname. Tom Langlaw.
See, Tom's big on the Discord, and actually
Right.
big NFL guy. So I talk to Tom quite a bit. I've only ever seen his name written down. I think it's Tom Langlois. That's how I would pronounce it. But
Right.
obviously, Tom,
Langlois.
if you want to send me a voice note, correct me.
Yeah, sorry, Tom, if I got it wrong. In fact, I think I've interacted with him on the Discord maybe this week. I think Tom's session around guided reading booklets is quite interesting, because I know in recent years there's been, I say gradual because some schools still use the carousel approach to guided reading. But many schools have moved away towards sort of the whole class approach. So the idea of booklets is something I've personally not heard around in that shift. So I'd be intrigued to see what that looks like in terms of actual practice.
Yeah, another one. Yeah, like I said, Tom's class based, and again, thinking, really good to see that he'd put himself forward for this. Because that's what we want. We want people to, new voices and
Absolutely.
sort of a range of voices. So yeah, and so I'm trying to think what my reading teaching would be negligibly, it's pretty poor. So I'd be interested to see what Tom has to say. And then we got Holly Lane, who is traveling all the way from Florida. She was going to speak at your conference in November.
Yeah.
And decided that she still wanted to make the trip over to the UK. And so Dr. Holly Lane is going to come and join us and talk about the key features of effective phonics instruction. So it'll be really interesting because I know Chris really regards Holly's work.
Absolutely. And it'll be interesting to just hear an American colleague talk about, I'm sure there might be some element around what phonics, how it's taught and approached in America. If only at least like sort of anecdotally, but that would be interesting to listen to.
Well, I mean, certainly every academic that we've had on the podcast talking about an element of literacy. So obviously there's that Danielle Colin-Brander was talking about irregular spellings, and Kathy Russell spoke to Neil and Chris about morphology. They've always been really, really excellent in terms of how, understanding the domain, but also understanding how that can impact your behavior. So I'm expecting sort of that to be a fantastic session.
Yeah.
I'm going to split myself up into a million pieces here, really. But it's good to see all these. And then you've sort of mentioned the next group a little bit because Nathan and his work on metacognition, I think, sort of falls into the sort of more theoretical cog sci application in the classroom work. And you've got a few there, like Adam Woodward talking about knowledge organizers. I know that I think I've seen him talk about knowledge organizers. I've certainly read stuff that he's written about knowledge organizers. I mean, how familiar with his work are you?
So I have seen that talk, and I also, like, in our curriculum we have knowledge organisers. So I found it an interesting talk to listen to. And Adam is someone who spent a long time thinking about the sort of design and implementation of those, not only within an individual classroom but across the primary phase. So he has that sort of unique experience in implementing them school wide. So if it's something you're interested in, definitely check it out.
Nice. And then we've got Ella Martin, who I think deputy head of TSAT, which is one of the multi-academy trusts on my doorstep. My first school joined TSAT just as I was sort of on my way into deputy headship. So the science of memory and its application to the classroom sounds like a great primer if, it's your first conference and you're not really sure about the kind of things that go on at conferences. I think, if everyone's got that base understanding of the science of memory, then everything else you're likely to hear at a conference, I think, feeds from that, because certainly I'm going to be talking about EAL for Rob Sharples and his Heddle group next week. And it starts with working memory and then builds from there. And I think Ella's session is a really good example of that. And Katie Marl, Unlocking the Power of Learning, she's going to be talking about Meyer's work. How much have you engaged with that? And what do you think people can expect whenever they're sort of finding out more about Meyer?
That will very likely be one, if I'm not on the stand or in another session, I'd 100% be going to, because all that work around sort of contiguity principles, multimedia learning, all the different effects and principles linked to cognitive load theory that can help us to better design instruction, to remove the fluff, to make it more concise, and essentially just make it easier and more effective for pupils to learn what it is we're trying to convey to them. Richard Meyer is someone who's very held in very high esteem by sort of those who consider instructional design. That's 100% one that I'd be very interested in. And I also think that cognitive science, it's been sort of a few years we've been riding this wave where it's had this sort of huge light shone on it in recent years. But I think it's an area of practice where even if you think you're incredibly clued up on it and you know it really well, there's always more to go back and learn. And I say that as someone who's like delivered and engaged in a lot of CPD that's gone over working memory, long-term memory, retrieval practice, etc. And I'm always learning little just tidbits here and there that are improving my understanding. Absolutely thinking about that sort of cognitive science and how we can apply it in the classroom, essential.
Yeah, I mean, the first couple of sessions I did on retrieval practice, probably like 2016, 2017. And there's no way I do the same sessions now. I mean, there'll be a lot of similarities, but I feel like I know a whole lot more than I did back then, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, there's always something new, always like a perspective, or when someone else explains it really, really well, then you go, oh, now I see what that means, and even just talking to you guys all the time, I understand that, so 100% with you on that one. This one's sort of been dragged down by someone talking about how they make tasks more effective.
Don't go to that one, sounds rubbish.
But it's almost like our curriculum thread or things that are pertain to curriculum. So, I mean, what are you going to be talking about in your session, Elliot?
Well, I'll likely start with what we were just talking about, a bit of cognitive science and how we know the brain learns. And then I'll explore some stuff around how tasks fail based on my own experience. And then I get to visit a lot of classrooms. So I think I'll talk about that in line with what we know about learning. And then I'll look into how we can make and design our tasks to be more effective for people in terms of getting them to learn what we want them to learn.
Nice. And
That
I've
was a
seen you.
terrible sales pitch. It's been a while since I've done this session, but task design is something I'm very interested in. I look
I
forward
mean,
to speaking
I
about
think
it.
I've been like 5 times to a version of this talk, and it's always really well attended. You
Yeah,
know.
it is because I think it's I think tasks are something in my mind are is very under discussed. Curriculum design has been at the forefront along with cognitive science in the last few years. But in that discussion, it's very, very rare that you hear tasks being mentioned, which I find really interesting because you can have the world's best curriculum and best teaching, but children need to have the application of what they've been taught to really help to cement that understanding. Um, so yeah, that's why I find tasks in particular quite interesting. I can see there's a couple other very interesting curriculum design sessions here.
Yes, I mean, I think I probably should have apologized at the start because lots of these names I've only ever read. I've never heard them, but is it Connor Haven, who certainly was a HMI at one point, perhaps still, not entirely sure. But he's going to be talking about subject leadership and why evaluating and adapting the curriculum matters, and how to do it, which I think is, in terms of nuts and bolts, when you're a subject leader, your vision for the subject and the curriculum are intimately related, and how that ultimately gets enacted in school. So I think very, very important for anyone who's in that position where they maybe not so sure about how those things piece together, or they've inherited a subject that they don't perhaps really know much about. I
Yeah.
think, or even just new to subject leadership. I think really, really important, especially with someone with that amount of experience of going around different schools and stuff like that. There.
Yeah, and I mean, undoubtedly, I imagine he'll be sharing some pearls of wisdom around sort of general subject leadership, so that if you do end up starting to lead another subject you're not leading currently, you can still apply that same thinking, because there's a lot of general understanding around evaluating and adapting the curriculum that we can apply to no matter what subject we're leading.
And obviously we got Alex Furlan, who's fantastic, been on the podcast. She's going to be talking about a very specific case study and closing the almost the gap. She calls it the chasm between key stages, using her subject of history, which I think, this is probably the only one that bridges across specifically, because I think lots of the ideas bridge across phases, but this one's actually going to focus on how we can bridge that gap. So I think really interesting.
Yeah, and she works in a context like an all through context, doesn't she? With I think she's originally secondary and like history background, but she works in the primary phase of her all through school. So quite an interesting and unique perspective. I've also worked in an all through school, so it's quite an interesting context to work with, and to be able to have that continuity between what happens in primary and secondary. There are not many people who get the fortune of having that sort of responsibility. So if you're someone who's interested in history, subject leadership, and history generally, curriculum design, and also about how we can support pupils in that sort of next stage of education, and it sounds like a talk you want to go to.
And then almost the last one in this little thread is Jack Cowling, who was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. He's going to be exploring explicit vocabulary instruction. And so Jack is almost, he spent a lot of time thinking about how the principles of cognitive science can apply. And this went down really well at the conference we did in Abu Dhabi a couple of weeks ago.
All right.
And I think, so he's going to be traveling all the way from Abu Dhabi. So I'm going to work out exactly who is traveling the furthest, but it's between Jack and Holly, I think.
They get they must get 2 tickets in the raffle.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, but I mean, vocabulary instruction is one of those things that we've just sort of been talking about in the last few minutes. Is that I think it's an area that I think I'm particularly well read on, and I think I do well as like a teacher in my own classroom sort of thing. But I imagine there's going to be a lot more to learn about, and there'll be things that Jake will be sharing that I haven't thought about before. And I think vocabulary instruction is something that should be central to every single lesson. That's something I passionately believe. So what he'll be talking about will be very useful in daily, regular practice that you can use a lot.
Well, that's the thing. I read, to mention Rob Sharples again, I read one of his posts on LinkedIn, and he was talking about how vocabulary instruction needs to have meaning as well. And so if it is that regular and it's happening all the time, then that's more likely to be connected with things that mean stuff in the classroom. So then we want to make sure that the foundation subjects, it's impossible to represent all. What do we got? Are 11 of them foundation now? 9, 10? But we got Charles Bankovitz talking about why other countries may be more successful at modern foreign languages than the UK, which again is one I really want to go to because this is a
Yeah.
bias that I hold. I think how come obviously English being the what is it, the lingua franca, which I always find really funny. um, it puts us almost at a somewhat of a disadvantage, but I do think language instruction leaves a lot to be desired. And so, yeah, really interesting to see what Charles thinks. I mean, you're actually working on some language stuff at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, and also my experience, like I did German at school and went on German exchange trips 2 times, I think, and how fluently um, other people speak English as like a second language compared to how we were as teenagers. They're just leagues ahead of us. I mean, I remember as one of those exchange trips, I worked in a kindergarten, and even like their English, it was basic, very basic. But they were learning like counting stuff, but they were doing it then in the kindergarten, in the first year of schooling. They were already learning English. I mean that's a significant difference. So that is actually one as somebody who learned German for a long time and is interested in learning other languages. I think that would be, if I'm free, a session I might go to as well.
We had Naomi Pilling on talking about art on the podcast recently, but she's going to do a session on music and creating a successful music curriculum and why it's important. I mean, what do you know of Naomi's work in this field? Because she obviously she's a colleague of yours, isn't she?
Yeah, so Naomi's a colleague of mine. I was sitting in the office across from her last year when she was writing our music curriculum. Um, and like it just, as I was reading it, it just blows my mind. I don't know how she managed to keep all those in my mind. Like as you're doing a curriculum design, it's all these plates spinning and to try and draw these links across and keep the sequence. And like as somebody who has no musical background at all, no musical knowledge whatsoever, I found it very interesting, good development for myself personally to read through the curriculum. I mean, this is what's quite exciting about this strand. Like, I don't know about you, but how often do you see MFL, music, and IT, CPD at any event? I like, you just don't see it. You don't see it at other events. So that is really, this is arguably the most exciting strand in that sense, because I personally attend a lot of sort of conferences, a lot of events, attend a lot of things remotely. You just don't see this sort of CPD being offered.
Yeah, I think exactly that. I think they're the kind of subjects that teachers shy away from if they're not in their sort of
Yeah,
their
absolutely.
comfort zone from the start. If you're not a linguist or if you're not a musician, you probably sort of try and push them to the day that your supply teacher is covering your class or whatever.
Yeah.
And same with coding as well. So yeah, so I think really of all the foundation subjects, I think these three reasonably important or like exciting to have available. And then we got sort of coaching slash teacher development. Sam Thomas, he obviously was at Step with Neil and Matt now at Kite, and I've seen lots of the great work that they're doing there. He's going to be talking about collaboration at scale.
Right.
Lloyd is going to be talking about implementation. His session's sort of, I don't know what is them, not controversially but provocatively entitled "The Problem with Implementation," and
Yeah.
we know how carefully he's thought. We know that he's very honest about the mistakes he makes and how he fixes them and stuff like that there. So I think it'd be really interesting listening to those two talking about how we can get things to work at those two different scales.
Yeah, an interesting parallel there, isn't there, about doing it at scale and doing it with an individual school. And I mean, you and I know how much time and effort Lloyd spends on implementing things. He is not somebody to rush into something or to try and take a shiny thing he's seen at another school and implement it straight away. He is someone who really, really does spend the time thinking about it carefully and rather diligently, and then maps out how he's going to implement it, the phases of feedbacking on it, developing teachers, like yeah, if you're trying to implement something school wide, and I don't know if this is quite necessarily the same session I've seen him do before, but I've seen him talk about implementation, and he is somebody who's really, really thought hard about it. So if you're thinking about implementing something school wide, absolutely. And then yeah, Kite, Sam Thomas at Kite. I mean, Kite are doing amazing stuff with the Ofsted reports they've had out recently, doing really good work. So another interesting session if you're working at that sort of trust level, or even across a couple schools or a couple classrooms, that is still collaboration at scale.
And then I think three sessions that are almost in like this triad, and again, maybe try and keep these three separate. You've got Alex Gingle, who's talking about whole staff rehearsal, which is something that has been sort of part of the conversation in terms of the early career framework. And I know
Yeah,
that Matt always talks about how in his model. Remember, I don't know if you remember that research ed he did that session with Lloyd, and talking about how that actual deliberate practice, whatever they may call it, was baked in. Then Shannon's talking about teacher development and getting it right in general, and then you got Alan Colback and Sir Cottingham talking about coaching. I see those three as related. Maybe that's because I know about the way the group think in terms of the sessions. But I don't know about you. When I see a real sort of connection between those three sessions.
yeah, absolutely. And very on vogue at the moment, isn't it, around sort of coaching and professional development, teacher development. And yeah, whole staff rehearsal. I think some it's like for some, it's like a sort of thing. It's like, why do we need staff to rehearse it? They're experts, they're professionals, they don't need it. But there is a lot of value in getting people to actually rehearse things out loud in person together, so you can give them feedback, guide them on it, just as we would with pupils in the classroom. So a very useful aspect of teacher development that we can leverage to really improve outcomes for our pupils at the end of the day. So that does sound quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I always feel really nervous when I ask people to do it because I know it's the kind of thing I wouldn't have liked doing if I were being trained. And so I'd be really
Yeah,
interested to see what Alex thinks about how to get that engagement and how, as a speaker,
yeah,
not to feel worried about, because in my mind, we're almost one step away from those icebreaker tasks
yeah. No, true.
that have everybody up singing. And I know it's totally far removed from that,
Yeah,
but that's my disposition. It's my thing.
yeah. No, absolutely. But I think some people are naturally more extroverted than others, and I think that is a very important thing that you've just mentioned that I'm sure he'll be discussing in the talk.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's what I'd like to see it so that I can then see what with clear understanding of the purpose, then I can be more confident in asking people to do it. So
Yeah,
so normally I get them to do tasks rather than rehearsal, but I know that there's a place for it, and so
yeah,
yeah, I need to get better at that too. To wrap things off, we've got almost like the general pedagogical decision making. Jennifer Sutherland, who this is probably my favorite title, Step Away from the Lollipop Sticks. Effective targeted question in the primary classroom. Nick Pointer actually said Jennifer thinks really deeply about this stuff, and I think he possibly has worked with her in the past. So the fact that Nick is sort of sending me in her direction, I'm thinking, wow, you can expect big things from that session. I think. I mean, have you come across her work before? I this vibes with me in terms of lollipop sticks not being effective. What were your thoughts when you saw it?
yeah. Likewise. I mean, when I first qualified and was on my teacher training, I remember being explicitly told to use lollipop sticks, and I was working in schools where everybody had lollipop sticks. It was very, very on vogue at the time. I really haven't really thought about the lollipop sticks for quite a while because I haven't used them in my own practice, but it'd be very interesting to go and hear in depth why exactly it's an ineffective approach. Like I have some thinking around it, but I'm sure Jennifer's going to share, as Nick was saying, some really deep understanding as to why specifically we should focus on other sort of more effective and targeted questioning approaches.
And then we got Ed Finch of Brew fame, is going to be talking about storytelling, and obviously we're big fans of storytelling and the power that it has,
Yeah.
and the place that it has in the mind, so to speak. So he's going to talk about the power behind effective talk. It's going to be really, really interesting. Then James Radburn talking about supporting practice through digital task design, which probably have to put it on at a different time, maybe same room as you, so that then people who are interested in task design in particular can go see both.
Yeah, and perhaps a different time to Alan's session as well, because they're both computing. Yeah, I mean, Ed's session on storytelling, a sentence you often hear from is quote from that Daniel Willingham book, Why Don't Students Like School, around stories being psychologically privileged. You hear that thrown around a lot, but you don't often hear many people actually going into depth as to why or what that actually means. Like, yes, we understand they're psychologically privileged, but what is it about stories in particular? Like when you and Lloyd did a session, at our maths seats conference we ran a few years ago, where you actually broke it down a bit more. And I'm sure that's what Ed's going to do. And storytelling, I've seen it used really effectively across a range of subjects: maths, history, geography. I think it's very easily to pigeonhole it. It's like, oh, this is unique to history or literacy, when we're actually going through like stories that have occurred. But it can be used very effectively across perhaps all subjects, I guess. And then task design, well, I've been, James and I was on a podcast with him that he ran with the Teacher Talk Radio, so I know he thinks very deeply about task design. So that's definitely a session that piques my interest as well. As somebody who is not particularly proficient digitally, interested to see how I can improve my practice thinking about that.
So I think we've got one or two, maybe three more, four more perhaps. But for now, these are the talks that are official, that are on the website. And I think, no, due to no fault or responsibility of my own, everyone volunteered. They saw the call for speakers, volunteered their time. I think we've ended up with a fantastic sort of selection for teachers, and I think this is going to be a really, really good day of CPD. Like I say, no thanks to me, I'll just be there and trying to make sure things take over. But really excited to see the speakers. I think shout out to we've got some fantastic sponsors who've helped us, because obviously all the money that we raise from the conference is going to be donated to Velindre Cancer Centre. And so we've got Sounds Right, PKC, Stylus Education, and Step Lab have all in different ways sort of supported the conference, and meaning that we can give all of the money from tickets to the charity, which I think is fantastic. So massive thanks to them. And I have huge respect for each of those companies. So it's great to be almost in partnership with people we really, really, really respect. So I think that's massive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing to add that I guess we haven't really touched on, if you've not been to a conference before, the talks are always amazing, but the thing that I always enjoy most and get the most from is connecting with other educators who are like-minded, who might even challenge the way you think, and you end up going away with someone else to follow on Twitter or Blue Sky, where you can start having more discussions around that topic. You can learn from one another. It is super, super beneficial. So if you haven't been to a conference before, if you've only been to one, I really do recommend you come say hello to myself and Kieran. We'll happily say hello to people, have a chat about anything. Task design, maths, storytelling, digital task design. You could ask us about anything. We're always up for those sort of discussions, and I'm sure the vast majority of other attendees and speakers we know will feel the same. So don't feel nervous about coming, even if you're coming by yourself. These sort of events are always very welcoming, very friendly. So yeah, please do get a ticket.
I think you're absolutely right. I think engaging more primary teachers. Obviously we spend a lot of time at these conferences. We find value in them, and if we can even get one or two more people who have never been before coming along, that'd be fantastic. And actually, our speakers are not only generously giving us their time, lots of them have allowed us to run sort of one's called the Bring a Friend raffle, basically where if you sort of recommend the conference to someone and you bring a friend, you could both be entered into this raffle. And then also there'll be one on the day for those who are in attendance. But if I'll run through some of them very, very quickly before we round up. So in terms of the books that we've got Shannon has donated a copy of 100 Ideas Primary Maths. Amy Howe has given us a copy of Rec and Rec 101, and Joe Austin, his new pretty much last
just
week
come out.
book, Small Numbers Big Ideas, will be there. I assume Christopher will have copies of his books because he never leaves the house without them. And then I've got a copy of Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics I can share as well.
I mean, look, primary specific events are few and far between. I mean, this might be personally my first one I've ever been to that's covering this sort of wide range of topics and speakers and so on. And the fact that there's books to win as well, just the icing on the cake.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't stop at books. Those are just the books. Shannon's also doing a 30-minute call on teacher development, an online staff PD session on either pedagogy or maths. Amy's going to give us a giant Rec and Rec. Janine has donated 2 maths goodie bags, one primary, one secondary. and either of those will either have a full class set of algebra tiles or a class set of rec and recs,
Wow.
which I know are like gold.
Wow.
Yeah, I
That's
know.
very, very generous.
That's worth the 30 quid alone,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, all of those sound great.
Yeah, Naomi's doing 30 minutes on ensuring excellent arts provision in your school. Adam Colback, a coaching session. 3 different coaching sessions from Nathan. And then I'm also going to do some CPD and some coaching as well. So
Wow.
if you recommend the conference to someone, and there's a special question that says who recommended you, if they put your name in, then both the people will be entered, and that's running for the next 2 weeks. So I think on I want to say the 12th of December, that's when that draw will sort of stop. If that makes
Yeah.
sense. So a reason to, if you're coming for the first time on your own, if you're coming on your own, bring someone else, and then you have a chance to win one of those fantastic prizes, or even more than one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Those all sound great. And if you think about the sort of monetary value, you couldn't possibly put a number on it, but I mean, someone giving even just like 30 minutes of their time to talk through coaching or something that they're an expert in is something you'd normally schools would spend a lot of money on, hundreds of pounds on. So that sounds like an amazing raffle.
Yeah, and more prizes coming in every day. So I mean, I don't like doing promo on the podcast that often. It's normally very business. Let's talk about
Yeah.
education, but this is for a really good cause. I think they support 1.5 million people in the sort of the area around the Velindre Cancer Centre, and so I'm going to push this as much as possible so we can give as much to this charity. So, like I say, we've only got 4 or 5 days when we come back from the Christmas holidays, so I think now is the time to get your tickets. And looking forward to seeing you there. So thank you very much, Elliot, for helping me go through the sessions. I think much more interesting than if it was just me reading a list of them. So yeah, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. And I apologize to the listener for the amount of times I must have said the word interesting. If when you're editing it, if you want to do a counter where it says how many ding, ding, ding every time I said it. But yeah, I look forward to it as well. I can't wait. And I look forward to meeting everyone, the listeners there. Come say hello.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.